Ditching a passenger jet on the open ocean, miles away from land, is something that very few pilots have ever attempted. To do that, we would have to deal with huge waves, long rescue times, possible sharks and very, very cold water. So even if the ditching would be successful, survival would be far from guaranteed. But it has actually happened a few times in history, and one of those took place in the spring of 1970 with the obscure US charter company Overseas National Airways. ONA, as it was known, was a carrier specializing in military cargo contracts, charters as well as lease agreements with other airlines. And back in 1970, they operated a fleet consisting of Douglas DC-8s, DC-9s as well as several Lockheed Electras. During the year before, ONA had been approached with a lease agreement proposal from ALM, Antillian Airlines, which at that time was a subsidiary of Dutch KLM and the flag carrier of the Netherlands Antilles. ALM operated a route network connecting various Dutch-controlled islands in the Caribbean, including Aruba, Curaçao and St. Maarten, but they were now also looking to expand by adding a direct flight between St. Maarten and New York City, using a leased ONA aircraft. St. Maarten is a small Caribbean island located about 270 kilometers east of Puerto Rico, which is notable for being split almost 50-50 between France and the Netherlands. The island is served by Princess Juliana International Airport, located on the Dutch side of the island, and you might already know about it thanks to viral videos of people trying to stand up against jet blast on Maho Beach, which is not something I recommend, by the way. Today, Princess Juliana Airport can handle aircraft as big as Boeing 747s, but back in 1970 the airport was much less developed and the runway was only 5,249 feet long with water at both ends. That made it too short for ONA's 4-engine DC-8s, but ONA's CEO managed to convince ALM that the flights to New York could still be operated using their 2-engine DC-9s. Now, using a DC-9 on this route was technically possible, but also quite difficult in practice. You see, while a DC-9 could easily land on St. Martin's short runway, most models didn't have enough range to fly non-stop between there and New York unless they were very lightly loaded. The only DC-9 variant in ONA's fleet that could make that journey non-stop with a reasonable passenger load was the company's only DC-9-33, which had just enough extra range to meet the legal requirements. So, said and done, ONA and ALM agreed to initiate this service using that aircraft under a contract known as a damp lease, where ONA would provide the aircraft and the flight crew, while ALM provided the cabin crew and handled ticket sales. But there were quite some problems with this arrangement from the very start. A major one was that a straight-line flight between New York and St. Maarten couldn't legally be flown by a 2-engine aircraft because the extended twin-engine operations, or ETOPS rules that we have today, didn't exist yet. Instead, back in 1970, aircraft with 2 engines had to remain within 1 hour single-engine flying time from a suitable airport in case of an engine failure, and on this route there was a very short stretch where the nearest airport was slightly more than 1 hour away. As a result, the FAA initially decided not to approve the proposed flights, which was a big problem for both ONA and LM, since they had already started advertising the service. The FAA proposed that the flights should be routed via the Bahamas to stay closer to land, but this would also make the trip much longer, forcing the flights to stop for fuel along the way. And if they did that, ONA would lose money on the flights, and they were already losing money overall, so that was a non-starter for them. But just days before the flights were supposed to start, McDonnell Douglas came to ONA's rescue by publishing a new single-engine descent procedure that extended the 1 hour range just enough to cover the gap in the original proposed routing. This meant that the FAA finally approved these non-stop flights, but that didn't solve all of the problems. You see, the DC-933 only had enough range to make that trip non-stop if conditions were perfect. So if there were any en route delays due to weather or traffic, the contract stipulated that the flights could do a fuel stop on the island of Bermuda. So the plan became to then fly from New York generally towards Bermuda. Then before crossing the island, the pilots would evaluate whether they could reach St. Maarten with the required fuel margin, And if they could, well then they could just proceed directly towards the destination without a fuel stop. This was a little bit convoluted, but by some miracle, the New York to St. Maarten route began as scheduled in January of 1970, but it didn't take long before the FAA threatened to ground the flights again, this time due to a dispute over the seating in the DC-9's cockpit. You see, back in the early days of transoceanic flights, navigators were employed to calculate the aircraft's course while out of range of ground-based navigational aids over the ocean. And by 1970, navigators were rapidly becoming obsolete. But ONA still had a contract with the Navigators Union lasting until 1971. And under that contract, any flight that would fly out of range of ground-based navigational aids had to have a navigator on board. And a very brief stretch of this route met those criteria, so ONA was obliged to supply a qualified navigator. Now, ONA had already arranged for the pilots to traverse that small gap using brand new Loran C long-range navigational equipment, so there was actually nothing for that navigator to do, but still, they had to be there. The DC-9 was obviously designed to only have a cockpit crew of 2, not 3, so the navigator had to sit in the tiny, uncomfortable jump seat for the 3.5-hour flight down and then back up again from St. Maarten. And shortly after the service began, the FAA sent an inspector to ride along on one of the flights for a routine operations check. But because the jump seat wasn't available, the pilots told the inspector to now sit in the cabin instead, which was obviously not acceptable to the FAA, since the whole point was to monitor the procedures used by the flight crew. As a result, the FAA threatened to ground the flights immediately, which then forced ONA to quickly hash out an agreement with the Navigators Union, allowing the FAA inspectors to occupy the jump seat upon request. This sounds almost comical now, but it presented real problems for ONA, and as we will soon see, it would not be the last issue they would have with the FAA over this particular route. Now, when we're on the subject of problems, you don't happen to be reusing your internet password on multiple different websites, do you? Well, most people do, and the problem with that obviously comes when a site inevitably gets hacked, maybe even without your knowledge, causing that password to now be potentially used on dozens of other sites. Luckily, today's sponsor, NordVPN, has a simple solution for this. Their dark web monitor continuously scans underground hacker websites and immediately alerts you if your credentials show up for sale somewhere, enabling you to quickly then change your passwords before it's too late. Nord is now also being recognized by leading cybersecurity labs for their Threat Protection Pro feature, which blocks malicious sites designed to steal your information or infect your device with malware. And the cool thing is that it is active even if the VPN itself is not. What this all means is that NordVPN is now much more than just a great VPN. They are the SR-71 of VPNs, keeping you safe and connected to your favorite content from wherever you are in the world at a lightning speed. Right now, you, my viewers, will get 4 extra months free when you sign up for the 2-year deal using this QR code or by going to nordvpn.com/pilot. And remember, Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you lose nothing by trying. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the story. So by this point, it's pretty clear that ONA was on thin ice with the FAA for multiple reasons. And another reason was added in April of 1970, when a flight to St. Maarten had landed with less than the minimum required fuel remaining, while an FAA inspector was on board. And to understand why that is so significant for this story, we need to talk about how the required fuel was normally calculated. Every flight was required to take off, not only with enough fuel to taxi to the runway and to fly to the destination, but also enough to make a missed approach, to fly to the furthest designated alternate airport, then hold for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet, that's something known as the final reserve, and then land with an additional reserve equal to 10% of the en route trip fuel, known as the contingency fuel. So the idea was that the flights should land at the destination with at least the 30 minutes holding plus alternate airport fuel still in the tanks. If while en route the flight crew calculated that they would likely land with less fuel than that, well then they should consider diverting to an alternate airport preemptively, unless a successful landing at a destination could be virtually guaranteed. During that April 1970 incident, a flight landed in St. Maarten with only 3,400 pounds of fuel remaining, which was much less than the final reserve plus alternate airport fuel. The inspectors investigated the planning of the flight, eventually prompting the FAA to impose new minimum fuel requirements specifically for ONA's New York to St. Maarten service. In its bulletin, the FAA stipulated that the expected fuel on arrival for these flights must not be less than 7,000 pounds, and that bulletin that they created was then distributed to all ONA staff on May 1st, 1970, just one day before the events of this story. So on the 2nd of May, an ONA flight crew then arrived at New York's JFK International Airport to operate the flight down towards St. Maarten. In command was a 37-year-old captain with 12,000 flying hours, including 1,700 on the DC-9, and he had a pretty wild personal background. He and the CEO of ONA were old Air Force buddies, and in 1967 the CEO had approached his captain with an offer to become ONA's chief pilot for the DC-9 fleet, which he also accepted. He described himself as a traditional stick-and-rudder aviator who didn't like using the autopilot much because he thought it would make him lazy. And he was also known for being hard on trainees, something he was so proud of that he repeatedly went around referring to himself as a cherub-faced assassin. But just 4 months after being appointed as the DC-9 chief pilot, he had then taken several trainee police officers on a joyride while the aircraft was out for flight training. And around that same time, a cadet who the captain had evaluated unfavorably accused him of allowing a random girl to sit in the co-pilot's seat during a flight. As a result of those accusations, he was forced to resign from his chief pilot role, although he still continued to work as an instructor. Later, he would be assigned a trainee that would turn out to be the first officer of the flight that we're soon about to cover, and the captain had felt during his training that this first officer's skills were too weak to pass a check ride. But he had still sent the first officer to another instructor for a second opinion, and that instructor ended up passing him, but ONA still decided to fire him anyway. The first officer had then appealed on the grounds that his probationary period had ended with his approved check ride, so he was not subject to discretionary termination, and that actually worked, which caused him to be reinstated again. It has to be said, though, that this first officer was not a very confident individual. At the time of this flight, he had about 3,500 hours in total, including 600 on the DC-9, but he had emerged from his training ordeal so shaken that he had actually requested to spend some time as an observer before starting regular line flights, which is not something that I've ever heard about before. Now, for some reason, the airline actually granted this, but at the end of April, he was told that he had been rostered as a first officer on the May 2nd flight over towards St. Maarten. The first officer objected to this, arguing that he had never flown internationally before, hadn't been trained on the St. Maarten procedures, and had no experience with the Loran C navigational system. But it is equally likely that he just didn't want to fly with the captain who had previously been so hard on him. In any case, his protests didn't work, and he therefore showed up at JFK Airport that morning alongside the captain and the navigator. Now, the navigator was fairly experienced, but had not been given any specific DC-9 training, and as I mentioned before, he had no formal duties on this flight except to fulfill the contractual obligation of just being there. In addition to these 3 flight crew, there were also 3 flight attendants, consisting of a purser and a stewardess in the front, plus a steward in the back. And all 3 cabin crew were ALM employees from the islands of Aruba and Curaçao, and all 3 had undergone training on the differences in the emergency equipment between ONA's and ALM's DC-9s, but back in those days there was no crew resource management training for flight crew to cabin crew communication, so they hadn't practiced ONA's emergency coordination procedures, which is worth remembering. Anyway, in addition to the 6 flight crew, 57 passengers also soon boarded the flight, for a total of 63 people on board. And as the passengers boarded, the flight crew set about calculating the fuel that they would require to make this flight. The captain had just picked up that new fuel requirement bulletin from his mailbox earlier in that morning and had read it shortly before the flight. In addition to the new FAA-imposed minimum arrival fuel of 7,000 pounds, the bulletin also incorporated the results of a Douglas fuel burn study that imposed a further 10% increase in the calculated en route fuel burn. That increase came from the fact that ONA had fitted its DC-9s with jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO, rockets to increase the allowable payload weights when hauling cargo out of hot and high airports. The fittings for these rockets caused extra drag, resulting in up to 10% more fuel burn than Douglas fuel burn tables anticipated. And since the accident aircraft was a DC-933CF, CF meaning convertible freighter, it had the JATO rocket fittings on it. Now, taking that penalty into account, the captain arrived at a figure of £21,000 for fuel for the taxi, takeoff and then flight to St. Maarten and the landing. And he then added another £2,100 for the 10% contingency fuel, plus £2,100 to divert to the designated alternate in St. Thomas, as well as £2,200 as the final reserve, for a total of £6,400 of reserve fuel. He then rounded this number up to the new minimum of £7,000 and added that to the trip fuel for a total required fuel of £28,000. Since the takeoff weight wasn't an issue here, he asked the fuelers to fill the tanks completely, which resulted in a final fuel quantity of £28,900. Now, in my view, that was a perfectly adequate quantity to take, and it's unlikely that most pilots would have decided to take much more than this unless they expected to encounter delays or quite bad weather at the destination. In this case, the pilots had been provided with an AirMet weather bulletin describing scattered to locally numerous showers and thunderstorms with cloud ceilings below 1,000 feet and visibility less than 2 miles in localized areas across Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands and the northern Leeward Islands, including St. Maarten. This was only a little bit worse than typical spring weather in the Caribbean, so the captain probably didn't see this as a huge issue, especially since the poor conditions were supposed to be quite localized. This meant that once the fueling was decided on and completed, the pilots just went ahead and finished up the pre-flight preparations, planning for just a normal departure. The technical log was free of faults, but the pilots did notice that the cockpit microphone for the public address, the PA system, wasn't working. At the time, the PA system wasn't a required item, so the pilots just wrote it up in the tech load and carried on with the expectation that this would be fixed at a later point. But this would soon come to have some quite severe consequences. Finally, after loading all the passengers and bags, the aircraft pushed back from the gate at time 11:02, operating as ALM Antillean Airlines Flight 980, with the captain acting as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. They taxied out to the runway as normal and soon executed a standard takeoff, climbing away into the crisp spring air over New York City. Now, in his fuel calculations, the captain had assumed a cruise altitude of 29,000 feet, as well as a speed of Mach 0.78 for the first half of the flight. That was then followed by long-range cruise configuration for the second half, which is just a setting that balances speed and fuel consumption to achieve the optimal range. This is significant because jet aircraft are more efficient at higher altitudes, leading to less fuel burn, and in fact the efficiency gain is so large that it substantially outweighs the extra fuel required to get up there in the first place, which is why jet pilots try to climb as high as possible, even on quite short flights. Anyway, as Flight 980 now proceeded southeast across the Atlantic Ocean, the pilots initially adhered to their flight plan and nothing unusual was noted at all. The fuel burn rate was in line with their calculations, so at the decision point abeam Bermuda, the crew decided to maintain a direct course towards St. Maarten without stopping for more fuel. But over the next couple of hours, the assumptions in the flight plan soon started to vary a little bit. Thunderstorms were building up along their route, and the pilots were therefore forced to make weather deviations as they progressed southwards. And they also experienced some light turbulence, so the captain eventually descended from flight level 290 down to 270 and also decelerated to Mach 0.74 in search for smoother air. A little while later, they descended further to flight level 250 and decelerated to Mach 0.72, also in an attempt to reduce turbulence, although I don't really see why decelerating below the turbulence penetration speed would have been of any use. In any case, these deviations caused the plane to burn more fuel than expected and also to set their estimated time of arrival back from 1442 to 1500. The captain estimated that they would land with 6,000 pounds of fuel remaining, having used up almost all of the 2,100 pounds of contingency fuel. But then of course, stuff like this is what that en route contingency fuel is actually for. Anyway, soon after crossing the Guava intersection, 211 miles north of St. Maarten, Flight 980 made contact with the Regional Air Traffic Control Center in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which authorized them to descend down to 10,000 feet. But San Juan also reported that the latest weather observation from Princess Juliana International Airport was now below the approach minimums. You see, because the runway at the airport extended into the water on both ends, there were no place to install an instrument landing system, ILS, and it still actually doesn't have one today. Of course, these days aircraft can fly instrument approaches using GPS instead, but in 1970 the only available instrument procedure was a quite difficult non-precision approach. This was based off a non-directional beacon, or NDB, located 600 meters south of the threshold for runway 09, and the procedure called for the crew to first initiate themselves over the NDB, then roll out on an outbound heading of 285 degrees before performing a left-hand course reversal onto an inbound heading of 105 degrees back towards the NDB, whilst also descending down to the minimum descent altitude of 600 feet. Now, if the runway could then be seen at or before the missed approach point, the pilots would have to visually align with the runway, which was slightly off to their left, meaning that the approach was also offset from the runway centerline. Because of this, the approach required a cloud base, no lower than 600 feet obviously, and at least 2 miles of visibility. When the captain of Flight 980 heard that the weather was below those minimums, he immediately concluded that the approach could not be completed, and he elected to divert the flight to San Juan in order to wait for the weather to improve. So after establishing the aircraft on a westerly heading away from St. Maarten, he then called up Princess Juliana Tower via HF radio in order to learn more about the weather situation and verify just how bad it actually was. Now, the tower replied that they had previously told San Juan that the conditions were below minimums, but that conditions had now improved slightly, with a broken cloud base at 1,000 feet and 4 to 5 miles visibility in continuous rain. It took several attempts for the crew to understand this report of the unstable and almost broken HF connection, but when they finally did, the captain concluded that the weather was now improving and that a landing attempt could therefore be made. So he switched over to San Juan Control and asked for clearance back towards St. Maarten, which was also granted. Now here I want to pause a little bit and talk about strategic decision making. At this point, the captain had to weigh in several different factors, including the already higher than expected fuel burn, the fact that they had now been flying away from St. Maarten for several minutes, burning even more fuel, and that the Princess Juliana Tower was still reporting continuous rain. On the other hand, the forecast had mentioned only localized areas of low visibility, so he would have likely felt that the chances of a successful landing were pretty high if the storm was now already moving away from the field. So the question would then be whether it was safe to fly back to St. Maarten, potentially make a missed approach, and then after that fly to their designated alternate, which was located on St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands. By this point, they only had 5,800 pounds of fuel left, whereas the diversion to St. Thomas would require about 2,100. And the captain knew that he should ideally land at the destination with not less than 4,300 pounds remaining, that is, the diversion fuel plus the final reserve. If he was projected to land with less than that, he should strongly consider to just divert immediately instead of trying at the destination. But remember that flight back in April, the one that had landed in St. Maarten with less than minimum fuel remaining, prompting that FAA investigation? Well, it turns out that the captain of this flight was the same captain who had flown back then as well. And to make matters even worse, neither the inexperienced and unassertive first officer nor the navigator was in a position to challenge his decision-making given the massive experience and seniority gap, and also because the navigator wasn't even in the cockpit at this point. So it maybe doesn't come as a huge surprise that the captain decided that he could make it, and more importantly, that no one questioned his decision. The captain figured that if the approach was successful, they should be on the ground by time 15:05 with 4,400 pounds of fuel remaining, which would then be just over the legal minimum. But that prediction assumed that they would be given the most direct route to the approach fix. And in reality, Flight 980 ended up being given delaying vectors instead due to some traffic in the area. And most of those vectors were then flown at an altitude of just 2,500 feet, causing them to burn 800 pounds more fuel than the captain had previously predicted. In fact, the flight didn't even receive its approach clearance until time 15:15, 10 minutes after the captain had calculated that they should be on the ground. And at this point, an immediate diversion to St. Thomas should probably have been made, since it was now evident that they would land with below minimum diversion fuel. In a situation like that, you should only commit to your destination if the weather clearly will allow you to land. And if they would attempt this approach but then fail to land, well, then they would only barely have enough fuel to reach St. Thomas, and no pilot wants to put themselves in that kind of situation. In fact, just thinking about it makes the hair stand up on my arm. But this captain still continued, and the reason was probably that classic affliction that we call get-there-itis. You see, from the captain's perspective, the conditions were above minimums and a landing seemed likely, in which case they would get to their destination and everyone would be happy. Sure, if they did have to make a missed approach and divert, it would be an uncomfortable close shave, but that likely wouldn't happen. And if he landed at the destination, it would be less complicated and also save a lot of fuel. That is exactly how get-there-itis get a hold of you and tricks you into a tunnel of bad decision making. And we pilots are today taught to avoid this by using threat and error management techniques, which include anticipating potential threats like an increase in fuel burn and establishing clear decision-making gates, such as minimum fuel levels at which point that we have to divert, as well as an agreed-upon maximum number of approaches. This is something that me and my friend Ben talk a lot about in our podcast, Captain Speaking, which I hope that you've already checked out. If not, there's a link to it up here. Now, another really important factor is the role of the pilot monitoring here, who should always be acting as the voice of reason, pulling the captain out of his get-there-itis. But the first officer in this case didn't seem to have said much at all, and there was no real threat analysis made by any of them. Now, it should also be said that what the pilots also didn't know was that the weather report from Princess Juliana Airport didn't actually reflect the real conditions out on the approach path. The latest report gave a cloud base of broken clouds at 1,000 feet with 2 to 3 miles of visibility. But this reading was actually taken with reference to the hills east of the airport, whereas the approach was from the west. Because there were no features southwest of the airport, only open water, controllers couldn't accurately judge the visibility in that direction. But people who were in that area at the time of this approach reported that a rain shower was parked at a short distance off the approach end of runway 09, and the local visibility in that area was possibly as low as 1/2 to 1/4 of a mile. Still unaware of this fact, the pilot soon overflew the NTSB and started heading outbound while descending to 600 feet according to the procedure. They continuously configured the aircraft, soon selecting flaps 25, lowering the landing gear and slowing the aircraft down to 140 knots. The captain then executed the inbound turn towards the general direction of the runway, but when they popped out of the rain and caught sight of the airport, he realized that they had overshot the center line and that the runway was now too far off to their left in order to align visually. At this point, they had about 3,800 pounds of fuel left, which was still technically enough to carry them through the missed approach and fly to St. Thomas with a little bit of fuel left to spare. But instead of taking the decision to just divert, the flight crew now didn't even discuss that possibility. Instead, the captain felt that he could have made the approach if only he had kept the runway in sight during the base turn. So he decided to maintain 600 feet in the same configuration and make a tight left-hand circle northwest of the runway. The idea was that by staying close, he could maintain visual contact with the runway, but obviously this was not what the approach procedure said that he should be doing. He technically had clearance to do this because the controller had granted him permission to do whatever maneuvers that he deemed necessary, but for the record, we would definitely not be allowed to do this today, both because it wasn't a properly briefed beforehand maneuver and because the probability of success would have been pretty low. Anyway, the captain now executed that tight circling maneuver, but he still wasn't able to keep his airplane out of the rain shower on the approach end, and as a result of this, he again lost sight of the airport, and for the second time in a row, he rolled out too late with the runway too far to his left. Now these days, most airlines don't even allow us to make 3 approaches to the same airport unless the third approach is practically guaranteed to succeed, but that rule was only implemented because of stories like this one. The captain now therefore decided to make a third approach attempt, only this time his plan was to circle with the flaps fully extended at an airspeed of just 130 knots in an attempt to keep the turning radius even tighter. Now flying through a second, level, left-hand turn in the full landing configuration would obviously result in a very high fuel burn due to the large amount of drag, but that was never really discussed. In fact, the first officer seems to have been little more than a passenger at this point, and there was no record of what the navigator thought. So the captain simply executed his turn without any protests from his fellow crew members, and this time he was actually able to keep the runway in sight throughout the maneuver. But because he had executed this turn so close to the threshold, there now wasn't enough distance remaining to safely descend from 600 feet down to the runway in a stabilized way. The captain initially tried anyway, but very quickly gave up after realizing that the steep descent would balloon their speed to the point where they likely would probably overrun the runway if he tried to land. So he now finally executed a missed approach after having made 3 failed landing attempts within the space of just 11 minutes. Calculations showed that they should have had around 2,200 pounds of fuel remaining at this point, which was just barely over the 2,100 theoretically required to reach St. Thomas, but that figure assumed that the crew would climb as high as practical using the optimal power settings, and any unexpected variables could cause the actual fuel consumption to be much higher, which is of course why we're not supposed to push things this far in the first place. So they were now in a full-blown fuel emergency, but that was never officially called out. Instead, immediately after abandoning the third approach, the captain called Juliana Tower to request a diversion, and the tower just cleared them to fly directly towards St. Thomas at 4,000 feet. Moments later, at time 15:31, Flight 980 was then handed over to the San Juan Area Control Center, where they were told that a higher altitude would be assigned to them shortly. In the meantime, the pilots glanced at the fuel gauges and observed that they were reading erratically, displaying values anywhere between 850 to over 2,000 pounds. Now, these strange readings could have been due to condensation on the fuel quantity probes, in addition to the sloshing motion of the little fuel that was remaining in the tanks, but in any case, the captain was certain that they couldn't have had less than 2,000 pounds left in the tanks, which calculations later showed was correct, and the first officer's maths that he was doing also confirmed this. The problem was though that this still wouldn't be enough unless they could get as high as possible as quickly as possible. And just before 15:33, the San Juan controller asked Flight 980 what altitude they would like, and the captain replied, "Anything you've got higher." About a minute later, the controller cleared them to climb to 12,000 feet, and the captain immediately complied, but curiously, he used a lower power setting than he should have, apparently in order to save fuel, which is actually the opposite of what you should do in this situation. You see, you need as much thrust as possible, because the fuel saved by getting to a higher altitude faster is more than the fuel saved by using low engine power settings, which is of course something that he as an instructor should have been well aware of. But it is likely that he was now starting to panic slightly. It is also worth noting that the pilots would have been well within their right to declare a fuel emergency here, and actually they were in that situation even earlier, as soon as they realized that they would infringe on the final reserve. But back then, the criteria for declaring a fuel emergency weren't as clear-cut as they are today. Basically, it was left up to the captain's discretion. Anyway, after the captain initiated the climb, the first officer asked San Juan how far they were from St. Thomas, to which the controller replied that they were 92 miles southeast of the field. But the captain could tell at a glance that the St. Croix, another of the Virgin Islands located south of St. Thomas, would be closer. So he now called up the controllers and asked for the distance to there instead. The San Juan controller replied that they were 70 miles northeast of St. Croix, and the weather there was overcast at 2,000 feet with 15 miles visibility, which meant that the captain now immediately decided to change course for that island instead. He instructed the first officer to find the approach chart for St. Croix, but they had been misfiled in the booklet of Jeppesen charts, so he couldn't locate them. And by this time, the inexperienced first officer was likely in a state of what we today would call subtle incapacitation. So his reaction to this escalating situation was basically just to freeze. This meant that the captain had to call for him multiple times in order to get any reaction back. And that also triggered the captain to take over more and more of the radio calls until he was basically doing everything himself. Flying the plane, talking to air traffic control and trying to strategize. With today's crew resource management training, we're taught how to prevent this kind of uneven task distribution from arising, but these guys, remember, had not yet gotten that type of training. Now at this point, even if they had distributed the task effectively, it didn't really matter much. Because of the captain's inefficient climb, they had now burned enough fuel to place both St. Thomas and St. Croix outside of their reach. And in fact, the only airport that was now still in range was St. Maarten itself, where they had just failed to land 3 times. To their horror, as they were climbing through 7,000 feet, they now saw the fuel gauges indicating only 550 pounds of fuel left. And seconds later, the yellow low fuel pressure lights came on, warning the crew that the engines were now on the verge of flame out due to fuel starvation. And it was at that moment that they realized that unless some miracle occurred, they were going to run out of fuel somewhere over the storm-tossed Caribbean Sea. Now, as soon as that reality hit, the pilot called the purser up to the cockpit and informed him that they were now low on fuel and might have to ditch the aircraft. But the captain's use of the word might led the purser to believe that the warning was just precautionary and that they would receive some follow-up if a ditching would actually become necessary. Now this, by the way, is why modern CRM training also includes pilot to cabin crew coordination and communication techniques, because you really don't want these type of misunderstandings to occur. As a result, the purser now informed the passengers that they would be preparing for a possible ditching, but he didn't know if or how much time they would have until that ditching would occur. Without that knowledge, the purser made the wise decision that the most important step should be taken first, which was to get all of the passengers into their life vests. So the crew now quickly began life vest demonstrations, but the process of donning the vests proved to be much more complicated than they expected. Many passengers had trouble getting the vests out of the pouches from the underside of their seats, and some couldn't open the plastic coverings, whilst others were confused about how to tighten the waist straps. There were also 2 different types of life vests on board, which used slightly different donning procedures, and that clearly didn't help. To make matters even worse, some passengers assumed that ditching was very unlikely since the preparations had been described as precautionary, so they took no action at all, and a few of them even got out of their seats and started wandering around in the cabin taking pictures instead of getting themselves ready. Meanwhile, the navigator tried to help the purser to reposition the forward life raft, but it was so heavy that they needed help from a passenger to get it out of its dedicated closet. Up in the cockpit, the captain was now faced with an even more difficult tactical decision. You see, a ditching on the ocean has to be done very carefully. The wise approach is to identify the direction of the swells and to land parallel to the crest so as not to crash head-on into a wave, which could cause the aircraft to break apart. And it's also best in any ditching to try to touch down with as little forward speed and vertical speed as possible. But if they climbed as high as they could before the fuel ran out and then glided down without engines in an attempt to get closer to land, well, then they would have to glide through the dense overcast clouds with only the tiny standby instruments to help them. And to make matters even worse, they would then have only seconds to identify the direction of the swells under the clouds, maneuver and then slow the aircraft down for touchdown, all without engine power. In the captain's mind, this would be close to impossible, so he instead decided to break off their climb and immediately descend down towards the water so that he would have more time to assess the conditions and slow the aircraft before the fuel ran out. And it should be said here that having engine thrust available is also a prerequisite in modern ditching checklists, so the captain probably was right in doing this. At time 1538, the captain told the San Juan controller that he would like to descend, which was immediately granted. He then called the St. Maarten tower to ask for the latest weather there, just in case, but he was told that the visibility was now 2 to 3 miles and deteriorating, even worse than what they had had during their failed landing attempts. So, ruling out St. Maarten, he switched back to San Juan's frequency and told the controller that he was descending down to the water and might need to ditch in the sea. The center supervisor immediately reacted to this, notifying the Coast Guard, who began dispatching ships and helicopters to respond to the now evolving emergency. The San Juan controller then again suggested that they should go back towards St. Maarten, which was theoretically still in range, but on account of the bad weather there, the captain rejected this idea. With only a couple of minutes of fuel remaining, Flight 980 broke through the overcast clouds about 500 feet above the water, and what the pilots then saw was probably downright terrifying. The sea below them was nothing like the Caribbean that we see in travel adverts. Instead, it was dark and angry, with huge foaming waves rolling in from all different directions. No one had ever ditched a passenger jet under conditions like that, and basically no one has done that since either, but this flight crew now had no choice but to try. With the engines running on fumes, the captain started lowering the aircraft towards the waves from 500 feet by descending carefully in 100 feet increments. Every 100 feet he then leveled off to let his depth perception adjust and lower the speed just enough to select the next level of flaps. He wanted to land with full flaps because that would allow him to fly as slowly as possible without stalling, which should minimize the damage and injuries. The captain also closed the rear cabin outflow valve to prevent water from coming in that way, which was part of the ditching checklist, although they would end up not getting much further than this on that checklist. Now, realizing that he didn't know how much time they had left in the air, the navigator now returned to the cockpit and asked the captain, who just said that he would give a heads up at least a few seconds before impact. While the first officer shut off the air conditioning packs, the captain then set flaps full, and the plane then rapidly decelerated from 140 down to just 90 knots, which was very close to its stall speed. And as he did so, at time 15:47 and 40 seconds, he called San Juan Control and said, 980, roger, we're ditching. And that would be the last transmission from the aircraft. Moments later, it also disappeared from radar as it descended to just 20 feet above the water. The captain now turned on the emergency power switch to ensure that his instruments would continue to receive power from the emergency bus after both engines flamed out. And at around that same time, he also tried to alert the cabin crew to prepare for impact. But remember that the public address system was inoperative? Yeah. Realizing this, he then instead flashed the fasten seatbelt light 3 times in a row, which he believed would be interpreted as an emergency signal. But the ALM flight attendants had no such conception at all, and even if they did, nobody in the cabin could remember seeing or hearing the lights flashing or any chime being heard. Now, the exact order of these events isn't exactly known, but if the captain flashed the seatbelt sign after flipping the emergency power switch, well then the lights would not have come on anyway. In any case, the result of this was that nobody in the cabin understood that impact was imminent, and just a few moments later, the first of the engines flamed out, followed quickly by the second one. The captain shouted at the navigator to "Get ready!" through the open cockpit door, and that was the first and only warning anyone in the cabin would get about the imminent impact. Now, the navigator immediately shouted for the purser and steward to sit down, but none of them had time to fasten their seatbelts, and the steward didn't even have time to get back to a chair, so he just sat down on top of the uninflated life raft in the galley instead. Further back in the cabin, a passenger shouted that they were about to crash, alerting the stewardess, who was helping some elderly passengers with their life vests. And instead of her sitting down, she immediately now started moving backwards through the plane, pushing people down into their seats in a desperate attempt to get the cabin ready. But sadly, she didn't make it further than row 4. In the cockpit, the captain now aimed for the backside of a swell in order to soften the impact, and he then shouted for the first officer to brace. A split second later, Flight 980 smashed into the surface of the Caribbean Sea with a tremendous force, estimated to be around 8 to 12 Gs, and the DC-9 then decelerated so sharply that it's thought to have come to a stop within a distance shorter than its own length. In a split second, the pilots found themselves completely submerged with a nose-down attitude at nearly 45 degrees of left bank, and for a split second it seemed like they were traveling through the water like a submarine. The captain instinctively rolled the wings level, which actually worked because the flight controls doesn't really care if they're submerged in water or air, it's all fluid dynamics. As the wings leveled, the cockpit resurfaced and the DC-9 started floating, pitching and rolling in the heavy seas, mostly in one piece. But back in the cabin, the damage was severe. Several people had been standing at the time of the crash, including stewardess Margaret Abraham, who was likely thrown to her death as she selflessly rushed to save her passengers. Most or all of those who were standing during the impact were likely killed instantly. But a number of sitting passengers also suffered serious or even fatal injuries after their seats were ripped out of the floor and flung violently forward. 7 passengers were also found to have been ejected from their seats due to failures of the DC-9's antiquated fabric-to-metal type seatbelt buckles, which relied on a claw grip to prevent the buckle from coming undone. Now, the exact number of people who perished during the immediate impact is unknown, but for those who had survived, this ordeal was now far from over. You see, Flight 980 was now floating on the sea, 35 miles from the nearest land, with rescuers still over 90 minutes away, and the DC-9 soon started to sink. As soon as the airplane had come to a stop, water started pouring in through every hole and crack, so the surviving flight attendants and the navigator immediately tried to deploy the life raft. But the galley where the raft was located was soon full of rushing water, spilled equipment, and even a passenger who had been thrown forward from the cabin. Amid this chaos, someone accidentally pulled on the raft's inflation lanyard, causing it to inflate inside of the galley, cutting off all of the remaining crew members from the passenger cabin. Now, behind them, a passenger had managed to open the aft right overwing exit, so people were starting to evacuate onto the wing, only to discover that the waves were crashing down over it, and their only choice was therefore to jump into the cold water. The captain became trapped in the cockpit due to the inflated raft in the galley, so he exited via the left cockpit window and then swam back to the left wing, somehow managed to climb up and open an overwing exit from the outside, helping 2 passengers to escape that way. At the right forward passenger door, the inflating raft had pushed the navigator out of the open doorway into the sea, where he soon found the uninflated slide pack floating on the water, so he just inflated that instead, and passengers who saw it and swam towards it, clinging to the sides, using it as a makeshift raft. The first officer had initially been squeezed between the inflated raft and the galley wall, but then he managed to escape and soon jumped into the water towards the inflated slide, only to realize that he had forgotten to put his own life vest on. So he instead climbed up on top of the slide and began taking command of that vessel to help all of the passengers who were gathered there. By the time the last passenger had left the plane, the DC-9 was now sinking very quickly, and the water inside had soon completely covered the tops of the exit doors. Moments later, the survivors watched as the plane slowly pitched forward and finally slid nose first beneath the waves, never to be seen again. The passengers and crew of ALM Flight 980 were now floating alone in the ocean, surrounded by broken pieces of the airplane and its cargo, spilled oil and other debris. Waves measuring 3 to 4 meters in height tossed them about beneath a dark, overcast sky and curtains of falling rain, but then, out of the storm, a massive, roaring shape emerged. Not a ship, but a Pan Am Boeing 727 who had been diverted from its course to look for the missing plane. The 727 crew managed to catch a glimpse of the wreckage and the survivors and soon radioed San Juan with the coordinates, which were then passed on to the numerous vessels and aircraft that were already en route. A US Coast Guard flying boat managed to reach the scene soon after that, along with a short skyvan operated by a flight school over on San Juan. And both flight crews tried to drop life rafts for the survivors, but they were unfortunately blown too far downwind, landing more than 30 meters away from the nearest people in the water. Now, the captain and navigator both swam to the rafts, but they were then unable to propel them back towards the other survivors, leaving them stranded. The passengers and crew ultimately held out for a terrifying 90 minutes before a US Navy Sea King helicopter finally arrived and began pulling people out of the water. The Navy crew ended up rescuing no less than 26 people, including the captain, all without having any trained rescue swimmers on board, which is just incredible. A US Coast Guard helicopter also arrived soon after and tried to retrieve several people using a rescue basket, but the winch broke after rescuing only 4 people, including the navigator and the purser, and the helicopter crew then tried to rescue people directly from the water by hauling them manually up onto the skids. But they were soon forced to give up that attempt and return to base because the waves were taller than the helicopter, making the rescue attempt just far too dangerous. A second Coast Guard helicopter then moved in and picked up 7 more people, which was the most that it could carry, but that still left 3 people clinging to the escape slide, including the first officer, as darkness was now falling. At around 1800, 2 US Marine Corps helicopters reached the scene, one of which picked up a deceased passenger and then left, whilst the second stayed just long enough to pull the last 3 survivors aboard before hurrying back to San Juan, where it reportedly landed with only 5 minutes of fuel remaining. All told, the heroic rescue effort pulled 40 survivors from the water, but unfortunately a total of 23 people were lost to the sea, including 22 passengers and the stewardess Margaret Abraham, who was posthumously recognized by the Dutch government for her bravery. Of the 23 victims, only 1 was ever found. The rest most likely went down with the plane, which sank to a depth of more than 5,000 feet and was never located or retrieved. Because the National Transportation Safety Board was able to reconstruct the flight using the testimony of the many survivors, they decided not to attempt a recovery of the black boxes, which would have been very difficult with the technology that they had available at the time. So based on these first-hand accounts and other evidence, investigators concluded that the probable cause of this crash was the decision to keep making unsuccessful landing attempts in St. Maarten until insufficient fuel remained to reach an alternate airport. The weather conditions in St. Maarten, which were worse than reported to the crew, were listed as a contributing factor, and the NTSB also wrote that more people might have survived the accident if there would have been better coordination between the flight and the cabin crew prior to the ditching. As a result of this accident, new rules were introduced to ensure that no airliner could depart with an inoperative public address system unless alternate means of communication was clearly established. And the FAA also mandated the replacement of those fabric-to-metal seatbelts with modern metal-to-metal buckles. But I think that the real lesson of this story is that we must always plan for the worst-case scenario, especially when it comes to fuel planning, and to try keeping our minds constantly ahead of the aircraft using cautious decision-making and crew coordination. In this accident, the captain made a series of decisions based on optimistic assumptions about the situation, only to be let down by reality over and over again. Modern training helps prevent us from slipping into that kind of narrow ostrich-like thinking, but back then, all the captain had was his experience and stick and rudder skills, which actually earned him some praise in the NTSB report, although his poor judgment call still lost him his license. And he passed away in 2024 without ever flying another airplane as a pilot again.
I knew I had a couple kids back there, Miller, and I didn't see them after ditching.
How did you know that you had those 2 kids? You saw them getting boarding? Yeah.
Yeah. Their father, I think, went down with them.
Now, watch this video next, which I think that you will really enjoy, and consider joining my Patreon crew if you want to see my next video before everyone else, maybe even today, by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.